So I wanted to use this workshop to provide some thoughts of how I've been thinking about this, and want to say, these are, feel free to disagree or challenge. I think it's necessary for us to have productive debates, but I want to share some perspectives that I think are important. And I did say this is going to be an interactive workshop. I'm going to strive for that, but I think it's also the nature of how this has come together as a first draft. It might be a bit more me sharing and having some conversation. So bear with me as we take a first swing at this. The really core ideas I want to talk about for this is one, starting with the idea that theories of change or ideas of how do we actually win are really, really important. And oftentimes there's conflict in movements and debates and disagreements, and that's normal. That happens all the time. But those debates are really necessary because it's easy to go down paths that where people already have resources or where groups are already going and kind of follow the inertia without thinking really critically about how do we be the most strategic and effective we can be. The other idea is within theories of change, an analysis of power is really central, and thinking about how do our adversaries exercise power, what does this power structure look like, and then more importantly, the part I think sometimes gets skipped is how do we as movements exercise power? What is our leverage? And I want to try and speak to that. I want to say some of the central ideas I'm pushing here is there's a really strong tendency and sort of certain tellings of history and theories of change in the US that really, I think, overemphasize the role of electing progressive politicians in winning campaign victories. And there's this sort of narrative that we win change by electing the right people and then they implement it. Which I want to argue that elections are very important, but the really crucial piece is the strength of mass movements in their ability to create leverage and pressure and create crises for those who are actually in power. I want to say also in this current moment of our assault on democratic institutions, mass movements are really can really be disruptive and cause real serious impact to the existing power structure, are absolutely essential and have really been proven decisive in other contexts where people have been able to remove dictators and authoritarian regimes in other countries. Movements that go beyond just voting are absolutely critical. And two other sort of aside thoughts, or not aside, they're less focused on the bulk of this workshop, but I think are really important, is race, class, and gender is throughout movements. History, the elites in power always seek to divide and exploit divisions between the sectors that are fighting for justice and change, and these divisions that fall around race lines, around class lines, and around gender are very effective at weakening our own solidarities and our ability to act as a unified force that can overcome the power of existing elites. It's really central that we work to build that solidarity. The other piece I want to say is the really centrality of, for progressive ideas to be powerful, we absolutely need to be aligned with a strong and progressive labor movement, and that the ability of people to stop production and organize strikes that create crises for economic elites is absolutely essential for arming progressive ideas with power that have the ability to win. And then this, I've sort of, in my own notes, got this a little bit mixed, but I want to, for the rest of the workshop, I want to say I'm going to get into these ideas in more depth. I also wanted to say sometimes I can get excited and talk fast and be hard to understand, so if you catch me doing that, just say something and I'll slow down. This is a bit of a rough draft of trying to synthesize some ideas, but there's really three main ones. Is how's power exercised by ruling elites in our country? What can movements do to develop our own power to contest that? And what does this mean for our current moment? So I want to start with just this, I've been speaking to it a bit, but this conception of how is power exercised. I think there's a tendency of thinking that the political party that holds majority of the presidency and branches of Congress are the main power structure. But I would argue that really the people that exercise the most power in our country are the owners of big capital. They are the owners of the banks. They are the owners of big business. They largely control the Overton window of what is acceptable debate about policy. And I think I'm basing a lot of this on a book, or some of my own research for a long time, but a book that really synthesizes this really well, this Levers of Power. I can send it out. But a lot of these ideas are being argued from this book. But I think one of the really central arguments that they make that's really important is a lot of times when we think about how does big business organize power, a lot of the discourse is about money and politics and buying of elections, and that being the central sort of thrust of their ability to really control what's acceptable political debate and what policy can be passed. And I want to argue that they make the argument that I really support, that that is part of the equation, but the much more salient part of the equation is the ownership of capital and the ownership of the economy and the ability to massively disrupt the economy and people's lives and politicians' political careers by disinvesting, withholding capital, refusing to invest, or moving production. And we've seen that in a lot of contexts. The argument they make in this book is this is really central to understanding the Obama administration, and it's really central to the argument too, where electing a progressive politician who comes into power on making progressive demands is really insufficient. And we saw with Obama that he came into power making all these great campaigning on really important things that the majority of the population supported, but came in on the heels of a massive recession where the existing banks, major corporations in the United States were effectively engaging in a massive capital strike. And you have the recession that's already tanked the economy, and the way out is for the corporations and banks to start reinvesting, creating jobs again, and putting that money back into the economy. And that would be central for Obama's reelection and for the political successes, get the economy going again. But what effectively happened, and this was very transparent in the business press, was over and over, capital, or the banks and the corporations, were refusing to reinvest that money. They were holding money in stock buybacks, in offshore tax havens. Banks were refusing to provide credit, and basically saying, we'll reinvest when you do what we want, basically. And these debates over policy often came down to the Obama administration making overt, we'll give you these tax cuts, we'll give you these concessions on healthcare, and our Wall Street regulation will be very weak if you please just reinvest that money, because they're really the ones holding the strings about how the economy is, the strengths of the economy. And this is the challenge, I think, the argument is both parties are really subject to these constraints, and they are incredibly salient. They can, if you're not fixing the economy, it's very hard for politicians to get reelected. And the other challenge that comes is, the only real way to overcome this sort of leverage is programs of nationalization, where you take these banks and other industries and put them under public ownership, which obviously faces mass resistance. And we really see that when countries try to do that, they face severe consequences and pushback. I kind of want to highlight a couple other notes of how this plays out, I guess I'll try to make this more interactive. Has anyone seen similar examples of how this sort of dynamic plays out?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, any other examples you can think of how this strategic withholding of investment or threatening to disinvest plays out in local or national politics that you've seen?
I was just going to say in Chile in 1973, they just made it ungovernable, and then they had a coup.
Yeah, which I was actually going to bring up. We're on September 11th. It's not just the anniversary of 9/11; it's the anniversary of the coup. in Chile with Pinochet, where it was the same dynamic. He came to power and through an election with promises to make dramatic reforms that involved major policy changes that cost big industry money that they did not like, and their response was to sabotage it. And so then that forces the government into a position of, okay, well then we're going to nationalize the copper mines and the industry, and then the response to that is a military coup from the United States, very much supported by the United States. And we see this in other places with Cuba, with Venezuela, with other places where they've been successful at having governments that can have autonomy from the U.S. And Greece is a particularly good example where you get Syriza in power promising these changes, and the banks and the European Union say, well, we're not going to give you any credit. We control the credit, we control the money, and you can't do your program without our money. This also is going to say, Washington State, Boeing is, oh yeah, Lisa, you had one.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I'm jumping ahead here. But since they're the people that are controlling the capital and making the decisions, are we going to a philosophy that we have to show them that it's in their best interests to change this? What's going to be the turn the screw here?
Yeah, we're gonna get to that. But yes, I think the big argument is that our focus should be on capital and on big business as our targets, more so than politicians, because politicians are completely subject to these pressures. And when industry decides that they want change, that's when politicians turn. And they have a great deal of ability to sabotage progressive politicians and say, we're going to make your program unworkable. The other two examples I was going to say was Inslee with Boeing. Basically, Boeing saying, we're going to leave unless you give us I believe it's a $9 billion tax break. And it's basically, he described it as a gun to your ribs of saying, what are you going to do about it? I see this all the time in Seattle politics with Amazon, of these constant threats to leave, and they're them going around and saying, we're going to open a second headquarters, have a bidding war of a race to the bottom of who can get to have Amazon invest in their economy. And it's really clear that, the economic planning, where investment and jobs get created is really controlled by capital and not so much by the government.
Andrew, eventually I would like to have you use the pandemic as an example of how the big corporations gathering money to pressure us. So you did mention one is Boeing, so $9 billion worth of bailout, quote unquote bailout money. So I want to know more about how they use the present pandemic to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm less versed on it, but I think there's many ways I think the similar dynamic plays out. I'll try and do my best to address that. But I want to move to my sort of just a point I wanted to make too. That I think it's a bit of an aside here, but I think is really important for just understanding global politics and international, which we really have to be very international in our politics for the climate crisis, because it is absolutely a global phenomenon. But the sort of dynamic of post-World War II, after there's a wave of anti-colonial revolutions where the European powers are formally expelled, all the countries still have to hold on to, are still saddled with the debt that was incurred under dictators or under European regimes. In the case of Haiti, still having to pay the debt for the cost of slaves that were freed after they had a revolution against the French and kept out the US and the Spanish, and are still paying that debt. And that debt is owned by the West, by the World Bank and the IMF, and they effectively say, yeah, you're independent, but if you want to continue to get loans with good interest rates and continue to get capital invested, you have to do what we say. So you maintain the same economic relationships of colonialism, of formal colonialism, where you have a European power administrating things. They're no longer there administrating things on the ground, but they're subject to the control of capital. And the capital, basically, it's still the same economic relationship we see throughout the rest of the global South. It's still a colonial, basically making cash crops, cheap labor, and exporting resources. And sort of to make the point of how salient this dynamic is. But I want to bring up sort of the other point is, while this sort of dynamic is a sort of use of sort of class unity amongst capitalists, there's also great divisions and cleavages and openings where the ruling class really fights with each other, and that creates openings for policy change. And oftentimes, exploiting those cleavages are pretty key to winning reforms. I think the example of healthcare that gets brought up in this book and how Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act got passed is really fascinating. They make the argument that healthcare became a priority because a large sector of big business was pissed that healthcare costs were going up. And because of union struggles, successful union struggles, they're saddled with having to pay for employers' healthcare insurance for a large sector of the economy. And because the healthcare capitalists are being parasitic and driving costs up, as well as the insurers, a lot of big businesses saying, hey, this is cutting into our bottom line. We got to deal with this. And they're pushing, both the Republicans and the Democrats, to say, we need some sort of change on this. And then the policy making comes down to, you get the healthcare industry that says, hey, we want to keep making money, and the insurance as well, industry is saying the same thing, but insurance saying we're facing a problem, not as many people are buying insurance, we want the government to mandate that everyone has to have insurance so we can get more of a market share. They sort of detail in this book how the actual debates in Congress came down to certain things were ruled off the table, like Medicare for all or single payer, which is vast public support, majority in support in both parties, is saying, no, we're not going to do that. But we're going to basically negotiate between these competing capitalist interests of how can we address all of your concerns and create a reform that makes things better. And usually no one's completely happy because they do have contradictory interests. And the real challenge of the Obama era was there was no major mass movement from below generating the kind of pressure where, in theory, a lot of big business could support Medicare for all because they would no longer have to pay for their own employer's health care. They would probably have to lose a lot of that cost in taxes, but the real obstacle is the health insurance industry and a lot of health providers. And in theory, within those fights, amongst the different sectors of capital, a mass movement can generate the kind of pressure where one side can win out over the other and you can get changes that are also good for people. But in many ways, Obamacare negotiated the conflicts between these different sectors of capital and then pushed the costs onto patients and workers. And that was largely the result of Obama coming into power and people sort of sitting down and saying, great, he's going to do things for us. And there not being a sort of pressure from below. And I think, so I want to shift here to sort of these examples of how have previous movements won. And I'm using some of the examples that come up in this book again. I want to talk a bit about the labor movement of the 1930s and the Great Depression with FDR, Jim Crow, the civil rights movement and the overturn of Jim Crow, and a couple others, we'll kind of check the time, the Vietnam War and some Arizona legislation around immigration, I think are important examples before moving into the contemporary moment. So the argument that is made in this book that I really agree with is that movements are successful when they create sustained crises for at least sectors of the ruling elite and are able to withstand repression to the extent that sectors of the elite say, we would rather it's better for us to make concessions than keep dealing with this because this is costing us too much money, it's causing us too many problems. We are better off making concessions than having to keep dealing with this. And it's very much a cost-benefit analysis, not out of the goodness of their hearts, and often comes down to, usually not everybody's in agreement, but certain sectors can win out when there's pressure from below that also impact politicians. If movements get to the scale that they really shape the national conscience and how people can get elected, politicians have more leeway to make changes that might piss off certain sectors of capital, but be supported by others. So I think, let me see my notes. And I want to say, too, a note on strategic concessions. Those concessions are always made with the attempt to neutralize resistance, to make it go away, and to try and peel off layers that have been sympathetic. And you see this a lot in labor fights where you get, favoring of more skilled workers, favoring of white men workers. how can you neutralize certain segments and break the solidarity that's existed so that this will go away and we'll have to pay as little as possible. And they're usually not permanent, too. We've seen this greatly with the New Deal. Since the 80s, we've been living through a counter-revolution against the gains won by the New Deal and a slow erosion of the victories that were won in that era. So I want to start with the labor movement and sort of, again, this challenging the idea that I think we get liberal narratives of FDR was a hero of working people and was central, obviously, was central to passing the political decisions that were made. But the argument is that can no way be separated to the context of a massive mass movement and labor movement in the United States that created the political conditions where a New Deal became possible. And that was much more salient than, it wasn't people said, oh, we need to go and elect FDR. It was this mass insurgency from below that created the political conditions where big sectors of capital felt it was necessary to make reforms. And just for some context of like the level of what that struggle looked like, is in the 1930s, you had, just in the period from 1936 to 1939, we had 9,000 major strikes in the United States throughout most sectors of big industry, the automakers, chemicals, tires, all factory sectors of the economy. And this went through a pattern of, FDR gets elected after the Great Depression, which, because of the context of the Great Depression, where there's massive poverty and people very quickly responding and making political challenges and demands, there was obviously a need to provide reforms to address that. But the fights for unionization, to actually create lasting unions that were won in the 30s, that had been a long fight for the decades preceding that had not been successful, did not come by electing FDR even though he passed certain legislation. It was very much by their own initiative and organization of workers. And I think I want to use the example of Ford and the automakers in Detroit. For some of the examples of right after the Depression of what things looked like, you had, as an example of many things that are happening around the country, we had the Great Hunger Strike in Detroit where 5,000 workers who had been laid off from Ford and everyone who was working there had their wages cut in half, marched on the factory demanding relief and to be rehired in the freezing cold, and were faced with basically the Dearborn Police and Fire Department firing a fire hose on them in the middle of winter and then firing machine guns into the crowd and killing 6 people in response to this march, making demands. And this gets to the point of the need to overcome repression. And they were absolutely not going to concede anything. And in this context, you start to see, with this mass pressure from below, the FDR government does pass the Wagner Act that compels companies to actually recognize unions and negotiate with them. But this passes in, I believe, 35, and there's absolutely no, industry just ignores it. It says, yeah, that's nice. We're not going to do that. And it's not until there's a continual wave of growing and escalating strikes, and particularly the key is those strikes actually unified the old sort of older settlers that have been around for a long time and newer immigrants that had long been divided, and a unity between skilled and unskilled workers that sort of culminated in the sit-down strikes of 1937 in Flint, where you have people that they don't just walk out and hold picket lines, they take over the factories from within inside, barricade themselves in, and this tactic explodes around the country with over 800 repetitions of it, where people just basically seize their factories and shut them down, making demands for union recognition. And it's at that point that industry says, yeah, fine, we don't think we can overcome this with repression, we need to make concessions, and that's the development of union collective bargaining becoming the sort of norm for heavy and light industry throughout the United States, and has so much more to do with the struggle from below than actually electing politicians. Obviously, politicians play a role, but they're much more subject to this mass pressure that's being created by people organizing of their own initiative. I think the other example I wanted to move to was the civil rights movement with Jim Crow and the demands for desegregation. I think there's sort of narratives of winning liberal support from the North was really key, and electing people that were sympathetic to the civil rights movement was key to winning desegregation. And the argument in this book, which I really agree with, is much more significant, was convincing sectors of capital in the South and the North that it was much better in their interest to make concessions than to continue to have this mass movement from below that was incredibly disruptive. And really key in that was the sit-in movement and the targeting of southern downtown businesses as a sector of the elite that could be moved over. And where you had mass direct actions and boycotts that said, basically, we're not going, as a majority Black population in the South, we are not going to patronize this business, and we're going to have mass protests that completely disrupt it. And when these campaigns that were sustained, that could withstand repression, where you had, Bull O'Connor firing fire hoses onto people and putting whole mass numbers of people in jail, and people continuing to come out in mass numbers, you got to the point where Southern business elites said, we're losing tons of money. This is not worth it to us. We're going to integrate our own businesses and push the federal government and local institutions and politicians to do the same. And I want to read, I think, a quote that's really interesting, where I think organizers really learned this through practice. There's a quote from MLK that I think is really good in this, leading up to the famous Birmingham campaign that was preceded by a failure in Albany. So he says, all our marches in Albany were marches to the city hall, trying to make them negotiate, where if we had centered our protests at the stores, the businesses in the city, we could have made the merchants negotiate. If you can pull them around, you pull the political power structure, because really the political structure listens to the economic power structure. And that really became the central strategy for desegregation in the South, was this targeting of southern downtown businesses, demanding desegregation and imposing significant economic costs on them until it came to the point that they said it's better for us to make concessions. I think the other dynamic that's interesting was, for Northern capital, the images of racist U.S. police beating civil rights protesters were incredibly damaging for the U.S.'s foreign policy goals, which had much bigger fish to fry for Northern capital, where they can make tremendous amounts of money by the U.S. being successful at bringing all these former colonies into their economic orbit and control. But these images of racist police beating Black people in the United States were very damaging to their ability to fight the Cold War effectively, of fighting for some degree of allegiance from recent former colonies that have gained independence. And you had a lot of big capital in the North saying, we want to make concessions, we don't want to deal with this. Now then, the question of, a lot of the movement moves to more economic demands, which become, that's a harder struggle to win. That's more cost to industry. But I think the really salient point here is the targeting of industry and getting certain sectors to turn and say, we don't want to deal with this anymore, please make concessions, is what can turn the politicians. That in the South, plenty of really racist, recalcitrant politicians that did not want to desegregate came around. And I think the quote here that I think really summarizes this is the beginning of this chapter. First, there's a quote from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It says, why can the city of Birmingham abrogate the U.S. Constitution with impunity? One of the reasons is that the most powerful men in the country are willing that they should. 10 U.S. corporations employ over 35% of the manufacturing workers of Birmingham. The directors of these corporations are among the top corporate elite of America. If they choose to act to change things in Birmingham, things would change. That's from SNCC in Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. And then this is Sidney Smyer, the president of the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce, 1963, saying, I'm still a segregationist, but I hope I'm not a damn fool. And this is at the point of them being successful and turning. Looking at time. I'm realizing this is a lot of me talking, so I can take a pause. So far, does anyone have any questions from all this? Yeah, Phyllis. Oh, you're going to have to unmute.
Yes. I just wondered if it was sort of implied, or maybe not. Were there direct conversations with the elites, or do you just send your message through all the demonstrations and boycotts and stuff, or maybe you don't even know? But is that like a good idea?
Yeah, I think it's that's a good question. I don't know the historical what meetings happened and how that was communicated. I get the sense, if that was the strategic choice, they could basically saying we're going to make you negotiate. But I haven't done the historical research to know, what exactly did those conversations look like or was implied through the tactics. Any other questions so far? Cool. Well, if Andy come up, feel free to put something in the chat or raise your hand and I can pause. But I wanted to bring just sort of a couple other quick examples that are brought in this book that I think are really salient. One short one is in the case of Arizona in 2010, where the Republican legislature and governor was passing really stringent racist immigration laws that were basically legalizing racial profiling of Latino populations, was met with a protest that basically was boycotting, saying let's boycott all Arizona businesses. And it was powerful enough that it got to a point where there were businesses based in Arizona that were saying, we're losing contracts, we're not getting money. And they basically wrote a letter to the Republican legislature saying, you need to cut this out because we're going to lose money if you keep doing this. And they weren't the number one perpetrators of this, but they were the ones that really proved the point. They're the ones that influenced the power structure. And there was 5 more really racist immigration bills that the Republican legislature then scrapped, saying, okay, we don't want to piss you off. We'll back off on this. The other thing that's really interesting the book brings and is an important point is the example of the Vietnam War, and the other sort of center of power is existing long-term state institutions like the military, CIA, the existing sort of, it's funny, you have Trump talking about the deep state, but there is a dynamic of, presidents, these are long-standing institutions that hold a lot of power and can also do similar things and cause disruption. We've seen this actually with police unions where, they can go on strike too. They can stop. We saw this in New York City where the NYPD went on a very explicit strike of saying, we're not going to deal with crime, big in response to Black Lives Matter protests. The Vietnam War is an interesting example where a lot of the question really came down to the resistance in Vietnam and the Vietnamese resistance. But the example they bring up in this book that I think is salient is after the Tet Offensive in 1968, many years into the war, where the North Vietnamese effectively take over most cities in South Vietnam and make it so there's no safe beachhead for the U.S. military, and sort of prove that they are not being worn down, and the question of can this war be won. After that, you get mass sectors of the business community saying, this is not worth it to us. We're facing real threats with inflation, with the US dollar, with how tight this makes the labor market. When there's so many people at war, workers have way more bargaining power. It doesn't look like we can win this. Look at the bigger picture. This is not worth it. And they go to Johnson, and basically tell him that the unanimous conclusion is we need to de-escalate this in 1868. And you have an example of Johnson going from 2 weeks earlier being bellicose that we're going to launch a national war effort and expand the draft and expand recruitment and soldier output, to 2 weeks later saying we need to de-escalate this and saying he's not going to rerun for president. Obviously, the war does go 5 years later, but it creates a dynamic where they start to try to shift the war to mostly aerial bombing and the Vietnamization of the war, trying to turn it over to the fragile South Vietnamese government. And then the real shift that brings the military around is with the growing anti-war movement, with the conditions on the ground where people were basically getting sent on suicide missions to fight guerrilla fighters in the army, where you had mass mutiny and defection within the U.S. ranks, where people were refusing to go on missions, were actively attacking their commanders and refusing to say, we're not going to do this. And then on the U.S. scale, after the draft was defeated, a massive amount of people refusing to sign up. They didn't have enough manpower, and there was also the threat of mutiny from the internal ranks of the military, especially after it became clear that the power, or the war is going to be transferred to the Vietnamese, people said, I'm not going to, if this is going to, we're going to pull out in a year, and this is going to be turned over to the Vietnamese, I'm not going to die for this. You had, it got to the point where the military leaders said, we need to get out, or the military as an institution is going to collapse. And that was the decisive, that internal resistance of soldiers was absolutely critical in bringing the war to an end. And I think it's it brings important points where, again, it's the disruption of this entity that brings the decision makers to a point of saying, this isn't worth it, we need to change. And it also speaks to really, both in the labor movement of this, of sort of strategically placed people have a lot more power in certain situations based on their existence within certain institutions. I want to say from that a sort of note on repression within movements. I think a really key learning from social movements is the ability to withstand repression and turn it around to gain more support is really key, because a lot of times the first response from powerful sectors is, let's just repress this. It's developed over the years, but you look at the labor movement of the 30s, this was very violent repression. You often had the National Guard coming in to break strikes. It was routine for company, private security to murder people on picket lines. The sort of scale of, we're just going to violently repress this, is a lot of the norm throughout U.S. history, especially in regards to slavery and indigenous people resisting genocide. But when it gets to the point that the movement proves that the repression alone, violent repression alone, won't stop it, that's usually a turning point that will lead to start to say, okay, what concessions can we make if this isn't going to work? And the other thing that's really important for movements that I think the other book I want to talk about, this is an uprising, How Nonviolent Revolt Can Change 21st Century, which I can, if someone can put in the chat, Scott or selection, is this question of how do movements effectively use the public revulsion to state repression to further mobilize. And that's a dynamic of sort of this political jiu-jitsu that's pretty common, where movements the people seeing the repression that movements face, with the civil rights movement, of people being beat in the streets, in many different contexts, it can function to further politicize and mobilize lots of people. And I think movements need to be smart about how to do this effectively. Standing Rock was a really good example of this. When the police sent dogs on nonviolent protesters, that's really when the camp started to explode and it became a national news story and people really mobilized there. And then also it's interesting, the current federal troops in Portland, the escalation from Trump led to a dramatic escalation on the movement side. So there's dynamics to think about here, and how movements can really seek to understand, to make repression backfire on the state and to be able to withstand it. The other thing I want to say is, not all repression is overt state violence. Once elites decide to make concessions, they really seek to do it in a way that peels off layers of resistance, like I was talking about. How can you, and this was really big in the civil rights, the sort of Black Power movement, where the Black Panthers really enjoyed broad popular support from a lot of Christian clergy, a lot of the Black clergy, and broad sectors of the population that was really effectively eroded as the U.S. government really started to make concessions and start affirmative action hiring processes, to integrate workplaces, to allow Black elected officials to be elected. It shifted the political terrain where there was no longer so much support for this much more radical program. And that's, I think it's just a constant thing for movements to struggle with. Every victory that's won creates new contradictions and new political terrain to deal with. The other thing I think to say is, COINTELPRO, if folks should be familiar with it, or if you're not, I really encourage you to look into it. This was the FBI program of trying to destroy movements. That was the U.S. government. It was discovered because someone who suspected they were being spied on, I think a Catholic worker, broke into the FBI office, stole the documents, and leaked it to the press and showed this is what they're doing. But a really big piece of that is a lot of the states learned from these struggles. Violent repression doesn't always work, but what is very effective also is identifying the existing internal fissures and conflicts within movements, whether that be over strategy, over struggles around race and gender and class, whether that be personal grievances, and do everything they can to just pull those apart and make those as intense as possible that it incapacitates movement, so they're no longer able to work with, people aren't able to work with each other. And that's really a central role of how the government tries to disarm and sabotage movement. And it's really critical for us how we think about how we address conflicts and deal with each other, because there's always this element at play. There's certainly, I would argue, they're still doing the same things today that they did in the 60s and 70s. We should not assume otherwise. So then what I think the next question I wanted to go to is, how is the climate movement engaged with these ideas? What's been the history? I want to start with saying the cap and trade 2010 under Obama, which gets addressed in this book, was a disastrous failure, in part because it relied on this idea that, we won the Senate, we won the House, we won the presidency with this guy who says he's going to do these things. And then you get there, Obama gets there, and is facing a massive capital strike and threats of deepening it. And unlike healthcare, there's really very little sectors of the corporate class that has a strong interest in addressing this. There's some that see it, this is something we should address, but it's really not seen as an immediate threat to their bottom line, certainly not in the short term. And you get a nonprofit strategy that's basically based on insider bargaining of, we've got these corporate elites that say they're on our side or want to do something, what can we get through? And then it effectively gets sabotaged from the inside by industry that says, no, we're not actually interested in this. And the actual bill, had it been passed, was in many ways disastrous by how watered down it had become through that negotiating process, and then was unable to pass, I believe by the time it was after 2010 when the Republicans took the House. It was dead in the water. And this was, again, in the context of you have politicians supposedly on your side in office, but there's a real lack of a mass movement, which is really the defining, I think, characteristic of the Obama era until Occupy Wall Street. This assumption that we elect the people and they're going to do what we want. It doesn't happen. I think where the climate movement has been very effective is these keep it in the ground campaigns that directly target industry and directly block projects. The campaigns against coal were extremely effective, although involved sort of these trade-offs where you could get the natural gas industry on side where they could take up the energy, before what we knew about fracking, you could say, and the Sierra Club did this, of saying, natural gas is better than coal. We can effectively, within the fossil fuel industry, exploit this division and block a lot of coal projects. And people were really successful at blocking coal projects under the Obama administration within grassroots fights. Here in the Northwest, we blocked the massive expansion of the coal export terminals up in Bellingham and in the Southwest Washington. But at the same time, we saw the massive explosion of fracking and fracked oil throughout the country. And there's obviously a very long struggle ahead. And I think, this is a real question. I'm sorry I don't come with all the answers, but I think it's a real question where we have proven to be getting better at keep it in the ground fights and have been really important and critical and probably did more to reduce emissions during the Obama years than any policy that was passed, I would argue, although someone should do a more scientific study of that. But for climate, we absolutely need policy. It can't just, I think the Green New Deal organizing is really salient that it can't just be a no. We have to really reshape the entire economy is really what's at stake, which is a real challenge. I think it's something we have to grapple with as climate organizers. Is this presents real challenges because we're up against a very powerful enemy that has a lot of interests against us, and it's going to take a lot of power from below to overcome that. And I think a lot of what's also necessary, and this has been happening more and more, is what the cap and trade fight really proved was it was this sort of nonprofit strategy of, can we get a sort of a grassroots movement, some popular support, and get these corporate people on side and push things through, which proved it didn't work. We're nowhere near the kind of power needed on our side to be able to win things. And we need to understand that it's going to take a tremendous amount of power to bring about these changes, and we can't do that without aligning with broader social forces and understanding how the fight for addressing climate change has to be a fight grounded in justice, and linked with these struggles for economic, racial, and gender justice that can unify a broad movement that can exercise the kind of power necessary to bring about these changes. And that's been happening in the climate movement more and more, but I just want to argue it's absolutely essential to build these alliances and really build them through solidarity. That really solidarity it can never be assumed. It's always a project of trying to build relationships and the willingness to fight alongside each other. And for a lot of us, I think, the climate movement tends to be more white and affluent, really showing up for other people's struggles and building relationships and having the political discussions of how do we build this broad coalition and strength that can win these things and fight alongside each other with shared goals. But what I will say, I think, is what gets dangerous is I think there's we see things with AOC and other politicians that have made it through are very helpful, but the Bernie Sanders campaign being this moment of hope. But we really need to learn from the Obama years that electing these people alone does not get us where we need to be. We need to create the massive, massive movement from below that creates the change in political conditions that politicians have to respond to. I wanted to bring up another example I thought was interesting of this change too was with the Wet'suwet'en fight in BC, where it was fighting natural gas pipelines in British Columbia by Indigenous people. It has a lot to do with both the dynamic of targeting industry and dealing with repression. Basically, they put up roadblocks and said, the government can't come in. They raided with police forces, with massive armed to the teeth police forces arresting Indigenous elders to get through to build this pipeline. And there was a massive response where the call out was not, they didn't say, go sit in your politician's office, although people did that. They said, go shut down the ports, shut down the rail lines, shut down the freeways. And people responded and did that and created this economic crisis where it hit industries way beyond the fossil fuel industry, and where it was remarkable. There was a 2-month period in February and March where there was a mass proliferation of railroad and port shutdowns throughout Canada that was creating an economic crisis. There was a point there was 40 tankers, shipping containers, sitting off the west coast because the port of Vancouver and the port of Prince Rupert were shut down, where there you have industry saying, you need to deal with this. But then the Trudeau government was elected based on support from Indigenous people and clearly faced a dynamic where these protests were happening because of state repression. So to go in and just bash heads and say, we're going to arrest everyone in all these blockades, they knew would just further inflame the dynamic. And largely the pandemic brought an end to that wave. But it's a really instructive, I think, it's an example, I think, where the climate movement and innovation in tactics that was really interesting, where it really forced the government to come to the negotiating table. And they did try to negotiate this is again these strategic concessions. They came to negotiate some questions of sovereignty. They were not willing to budge on the pipeline, but did make concessions in how the Wet'suwet'en as a government would be consulted and what powers they could have in future projects. And that's something they've been wanting for a long time. But again, these questions of strategic concessions. I want to switch to, or I guess I'll pause again and just see, is there any questions or ideas coming up for people so far? I know this is a lot of just me talking, but I'm hoping it's helpful and useful. Take that as, if you have questions, pop them in the chat or catch me at a pause. I wanted to shift to the question of the current moment and Trump and the election we're facing. And to start with saying, I think the other book I would really highly recommend is, as I said earlier, This is an Uprising, How Nonviolent Revolt is Shaping the 21st Century. There's been a lot of good examples of how movements have dealt with authoritarian regimes and displacing them. We're obviously in a very unique historical circumstance as you know, I think I'm making a lot of arguments about how our government is not very democratic, but there's also the struggle for democracy is ongoing and necessary, and we want to hold on to what degrees of democracy we have. And this sort of moment is posing a lot of challenges. But I think the example that gets brought in this book that I think is really instructive is the example of Otpor in Serbia, dealing with the Milosevic regime, where there's a long history of organizing that we could get into, but the sort of dealing with a situation like this of understanding the person in power is not going to concede the election, no matter what the results are, and sort of how to sort of prepare for a moment like that. And their strategy being very much understanding that these elections can be the sort of explosive moment, the moment of the whirlwind that can really create these massive spikes in mobilization where people understand the stakes and can mobilize and really understand and preparing for that, where their basic organizing was turn out to vote this guy out, and then be ready to shut things down when he refuses to leave. And has an example, I think, of really interesting the dynamics of how a very youth-based mass movement, where when the election came, the election monitors made clear that Milosevic had lost. He refused to cede power. People flooded the streets and flooded, I mean, Serbia is a much smaller country, but flooded the capital ready to remove Milosevic himself and put a call basically saying, anything you can do to not cooperate, to be in civil disobedience, do that. And you saw the activation of general strikes, basically, of the coal mines that powered the country, workers shutting down and stopping those, the copper mines being shut down, people shutting down the transport industry, and bringing a crisis where basically if no one refuses to do the things that make society run, an authoritarian government can't govern. And the real critical question, though, too, is, again, this question of repression, of getting to the point of, are the security forces willing to just violently repress this, or are they willing to turn on the person in power? A lot of times in these questions of regime changes, that becomes a very critical question. And there's interesting dynamics of sort of, within their protests, trying to maintain a degree of sympathy from the security forces. I think there's an important distinction in the U.S. between the police and the military, where historically military forces are much more likely to turn against their institutions than police are. But this question of, can you get, and again it comes down to this question of divisions between elites, can we create the kind of crisis where sectors of capital really say, we'd rather be rid of Trump than deal with this kind of mass uprising from below. And I think there's an interesting things with Trump where he's unpredictable and he gets in fights with capitalists all the time because he's out for himself and his own interest conflicts with other capitalist interests and they get unhappy with him and is subject to certain constraints. So there's real questions, I think, of where do different sectors stand? And I think questions of strategy, I would argue, and I want to think with people about this, of where's the best places to put leverage, but basically, can you get elites on side to say, it's better for us to be rid of this guy than let him stay? And where's our leverage points to kind of do that? Again, that leads you to the question of, and this comes up with Milosevic, is just because you displace an authoritarian regime doesn't mean the one that comes into power after it, like a Biden administration, is going to do what you want. And there's the much longer struggle of making that change. But I think the kind of context where if a mass movement from below is able to keep Trump out, it puts us in a position of being able to further mobilize for the kind of things that are necessary. That kind of brings me to, this is sort of the main thoughts I wanted to share. I have some concluding thoughts, and maybe I can go over those and then open up for this discussion. Yeah, I think I'll do that and we can go. I think in terms of questions of what does this mean for today, I think there's big points I want to make is I think it's really critical for movements to be focused on building our own independent power and organization that's focused on campaigns that can really create economic disruption and also hold on to popular support. And actually, this is the point I wanted to make. The question, I meant to talk about this during the Jim Crow question, is I think we also get very, in our heads, focused around this question of winning popular support. And I think it's interesting. I think there's things like Medicare for All have like 70% popular support, don't get passed for reasons I articulated. And then movements like MLK and the Civil Rights Movement was very deeply unpopular. When you polled people in the United States, he was around 35 to 40% do you support, or in the 30s to 20s, sorry, of support for the tactics of the Civil Rights Movement. People said they supported the goals, but they were not happy with the tactics. But because they were able to force these elites to say, we don't want to deal with this, please make concessions, that was more important. And the ability to have enough popular support, I think, of the movement, of maintaining momentum, of maintaining the ability to have strong movements, doesn't necessarily need the majority of the population on the side. It's helpful, but really the question is, can we maintain these strategic movements that can keep going? And I think that's it's a nuanced question, but I think people get too concerned about, do we have the majority of the support of the population, and will our tactics alienate people? And MLK was very clear with this from his letter from a Birmingham jail, where they turned around and said, you don't like our tactics, but you're in the way of us changing things, and coming around to support, yeah, we're going to keep doing these tactics because they're effective, even if it alienates certain segments of our base. We've shown that these tactics work. And I think that's really important for us to get our heads around of when we figure out pressure points that can work, figuring out how to be able to continue to do those. And I think another key is sort of democracy, autonomy for organizations. You see this, I think, with Sunrise is an interesting example where you have a national organization that's pursuing a strategy. This happened in the Civil Rights Movement. The real strength of the Civil Rights Movement was the grassroots strength of organizations on the ground that experimented with different tactics, that tried different things, and they talked to each other and figured out what works, what doesn't. And oftentimes when the national organizations are really holding the central power, they can pursue the same kind of tactics over and over when they don't work. We see this a lot with nonprofits, because of their bureaucratic structure, because they have staff, because they can be sued, because they're funded by big capital, have most disruptive tactics they're really unwilling to pursue, which makes sense. But it's a real question of leadership within the movement. The more upstart, scrappy groups that are grassroots, that are willing to pursue these tactics, are really central. And we shouldn't just take cues from national groups of what's the best strategy. And then also, I think a really key point is not all disruption is equal. Just because something's disruptive doesn't mean it's effective. The real key questions are, where are the sort of cleavages? Where are the openings where you can turn different sectors that lead against each other? What tactics can be sustained by the movement? I think there's real questions of also the repression question of what tactics are going to invite really harsh repression versus what can be disruptive but also be able to keep going. The other point is, insurgent politicians are useful again, but they can do little absent mass movement pressure. Had Bernie Sanders been the nominee and gotten elected, he would have faced a much more severe capital strike than Obama faced, and that's really hard to overcome without massive pressure from below. And the final things I want to say is we really have, I think, a duty in movements to really study history and really learn from the past movements' failures and successes, because so many really critical lessons have been made available to us at really great cost, of really people losing their lives, people losing tragic victories that set them back decades in organizing, but provided really key lessons that are very applicable today that we really, I think, have a duty to really try to learn from, because we can fuck up. I mean, we mess up a lot of the time and make strategic blunders that cost a lot. And I think there's a tendency to not study this history very much, and really want to encourage everyone to really do this work of really looking at past movements and how they've succeeded and failed. And I think, yeah, the other piece I wanted to say is the challenges this really poses of, this has really been a question about how do you win reforms under this really messed up system. And I think for climate, it's a hard uphill battle because they really are, a lot of what's necessary to actually do is really contrary to capitalist profit motives and faces a lot of resistance. You have to be willing to see the longer term of how do you get to a place where they don't have that leverage over us. And it's moving from reform thinking to how do we change this system. Although I preface that with saying, you know, I think there's problematic sides of the left where there's this, if it's not revolutionary, why bother? Where everything has to be built through popular struggle. We're never going to get anywhere without building movements and building the confidence that things are possible, and it's largely done through reform struggles that improve people's lives. But we also need to think about how do we get to a place where we change the systemic power structure so that they don't have this leverage. I think it's a good reason for the left to be very supportive of nationalization and public ownership that really weakens the capital strike and is really necessary, but it also faces harsh resistance from those in power. So we've seen all over the world whenever people try to do that. And the other couple thoughts of, you know, again, we need to unite and really understand how much white supremacy has been the real dividing factor that's weakened the labor movement, weakened most social movements where change is really creates this cleavage that can really be effectively exploited to make it so that we're divided and fighting each other against a common, who we should see as a common enemy. And challenging white supremacy has to be absolutely central to the work that we're doing and building meaningful alliances. I forget who first said this, but, you know, solidarity can never be assumed. It is always a project, and it's a project of relationship building and shared struggle, and takes real hard organizing work to build the kind of relationships and connections where we can overcome some of those bounds. But really, I think, especially for the climate movement that tends to be more white and affluent, really trying to show up and build relationships for other struggles in the community that may not be directly about climate. And I think a final thought I think of, just comes up for me a lot in thinking about this is, you know, this is a really scary moment. I think the discussion of fascism, of what could things look like with Trump. There's a lot of uncertainty, and it's hard emotionally to deal with. And I think it's important, like I know I draw strength from thinking about people in struggles that face such harsher odds, such harsher repression all over the world that continue to fight. And who are we in the West to say, this is too hard, this is too scary, we can't go there. We really need to build the solidarity, especially for the climate movement. We need to build international solidarity and understand and be willing to engage in this fight despite, you know, the risks it poses. So these fights are always risky. They always bring about, if you're being effective in disrupting capital, it invites backlash. And it's a frightening time, but we really need to be committed to struggle and understand, and not, especially, to not preemptively concede things. That's a real key with authoritarians of this sort of like, oh my God, well, Trump's going to do this, and what can we do about it? Be really willing to put up popular resistance, and that these things can be stopped, and right now is a really critical moment to be engaged in that. And to engage together as a movement and think about, I'm sorry, I know I worry this can be a bit of a downer because I don't have the like, well, this is what we do and how we win. But I think there are real strategic questions of, you know, what are the openings, what are the cleavages we can exploit, what are the tactics we can use, and where can we build this mass base? And I would argue, again, we have to challenge white supremacy and build solidarity across racial lines. We have to have a militant labor movement. The ability to sort of the key things of general strikes that make things unworkable cannot happen without the kind of labor movement that's really been beaten back and destroyed in this country, but it is on the upswing and being rebuilt. And there's a lot of questions about, I'd be happy to do another course workshop on labor. There's a lot of contradictions and weird stuff about how do we work with labor unions. And finally, we have to be internationalist. In the US, we have a responsibility as the biggest polluter in the world, as the global hegemonic power with the biggest military. Our struggles here greatly influence how struggles in the rest of the world play out. We have a long history of the real peaks of US movement activity have coincided when there's been international struggles. And have really been centered around the US, and particularly Black liberation struggle has been the sort of central force that brings about all the other struggles to the fore. Historically, it's largely the dynamic that's happened, and we need to be in solidarity and building those connections. And it's hard work, and it can be scary, but I think it's necessary, and I want to argue that it's really necessary to think carefully and strategically and really try to wrap our heads around, even when it's scary, understand how does this power structure really work and what can we do about it. So thank you. I've got Lisa with her hand up. Lisa, you're still on mute. I
know, I'm just working on it. Okay, boy, so many questions. And I do apologize. I had to take another call, so I might have missed a lot of this. I certainly heard you're talking about the fact that we need to build alliances with so many other groups to create a movement. Right now, who and leaders, I mean, right now, of course, 350's been taking a big role. And of course, I would say you probably mentioned Bernie's movement. But right now, where else are we at? So that's first question. The other one is with tactics and PR, we got to come up with another word for socialism because I know it's more of the older generation that has this ridiculous, allergy to even the word. They practically go into fits when you say it. But we all know that, we're all living it in our, Social Security and our Medicare, et cetera. So that's one thing. And then, how do you bring the people that are so, they're scared, they're also worried about their own self-interest, and say, you got to cross this line, or things are going to get even worse. Meaning, you got to join the movement.
Yeah. I guess. Okay, a few thoughts. I'm going to start. Sorry, what was the first question again? The really strong groups that are trying to come together. Do we have a few? Do we have a leader besides Bernie, for example? If you had to point to somebody. Yeah, I think on the national level, there are many organizations that are coming together a lot more and really understanding this need to build alliances. But I would argue, really, the strength of movement, especially because of the dynamic where national organizations have a lot to lose and don't often sort of launch these campaigns that can be more like the civil rights movement, the example of the sit-ins that were incredibly disruptive and people were freaking out. A lot of the more moderate leadership was freaking out about was launched by the initiative of young people without national organizational support. We're really critical. That's always been a critical drive in movements of young people and movements that are more autonomous, that are willing to push out and take a bit more risky action. That's really disruptive and forcing the issue. I would say it's really key. I would argue more at the local, like a lot of these national groups are building connections, but really at the local level of building relationships with people in your own community, getting to know who's doing what, and building the kind of connections. And it's really important, especially of, a lot of the safety of the more radical elements of the Black liberation movement in the 60s and 70s came because it had popular support and relationships from the Black church and from broader liberal groups. And it's building those actual relationships where we know each other at a local level and who's fighting is really key. And building the strength of our grassroots forces at a local level, I think, is really key. The national stuff is a bit out of our hands of how do big national organizations build their relationships with each other. And I would argue, too, of the really need, to not to say we should be in direct conflict, but understand that there's real limitations to what they're willing to pursue based on the nature of their structure. And that it's really important to build grassroots movements at a local level. This is really true with the labor movements. The successful insurgents of the 30s came about because of people organizing in their own workplace, and many of the unions sought to tamp down and be like, whoa, no, we don't want to do this. And the level of fight that won things came from the grassroots level, not from the top. The top was often trying to tamp it down and prevent it. And then I think bringing people on side, getting people involved, I think it's a real choice of, we don't need everybody to win, really focusing on who's at that closest point of being willing to engage, and focusing your energy on who do you know that could be invited to participate, or it's not worth spending much time. Your hardest opponents, your Trump-liking family members, are not your people you're going to win over to join the movement, but I think there's also important work that needs to be done in communities that have really been abandoned by the left.
Right. Talk a little slower. Your words get melted together. I'm sorry. And I have hearing aids,
good.
But
yeah. I was saying, don't choose strategically who to try to recruit. We don't need everybody. Focus on people that are close to that are sympathetic, that could move from passive support to active support, rather than your Trump-liking family members. But also the left there's a lot of just whole regions that have been abandoned by a lot of organizing forces that Trump people have taken over that I think can be contested. There's a lot of the whole Midwest where the Democrats under NAFTA deindustrialized, where the threat of capital strikes is made very real by the fact that they've already done it, is really central to how those places have been lost. And we need to contest those places. Sorry, I saw Phyllis.
Thanks. First of all, thank you so much for putting this on. I think it was really excellent. Like you say, we need to learn from history, but a lot of people probably this was new to them. And I put in the chat, choosedemocracy.us. So I haven't explored it a whole lot myself yet, but it came from George Lakey, who is a Quaker nonviolent activist who wrote this book, How We Win, a guide to nonviolent direct action campaigning. We did a book club with this. It's really an excellent book to discuss. And I remember the story about, well, actually, this was something else that he sent out. It's called the Anti-Coup Manual or something like that. And it was created by these Russians who stood up against, when they had just gotten out of communism and they were having a democracy, and then there was an effort to shut that down and have a dictatorship again, and tanks went around the Duma, the parliament, and the people came out, and they hadn't planned this in advance, but they just all came out there and they protected the parliament, which otherwise would have been taken over by this military coup. And what really impressed me was how, they put the women out front and they had signs and they spoke and they said, "You're our brothers and our fathers, don't shoot us." And they were, very friendly, and you can come over to our side, we love you. And it quoted some soldiers who said, "Oh, we were at this other place and we shot the protesters and killed them, and I feel so bad about it and I don't want to do that anymore." And so then they went over to the protester side. And so I think that's a skill that we haven't learned in this country yet, to speak to someone who is threatening our lives and our democracy in such a kind way. But I think we need to think about that and maybe practice it in trainings, because it might not come naturally. And let's see if there's anything else. How do you bring people along? Lisa was asking. Well, I think, if Joe Biden gets elected, and if there's, he's saying he wants to create green jobs and everything, I think giving people a job is a huge thing. And if you can give people jobs or services, and that's either through a government program or through a nonprofit agency, and give them political education at the same time, and point out, where this comes from, and this is a government program, And it's a good thing we have this, and it's also due to the fact that we had all those huge demonstrations back in 2020 and so on. So that's my thoughts.
Thank you. And I'll take more questions, but it makes me think something I wanted to say too that I thought was a really good point from this book was the argument that some of the levers of power, some of the most critical work of the anti-Vietnam War organizing was the organizing in communities of soldiers, of veterans, of trying to turn veterans or soldiers and veterans against the war, and doing it in a way that was building relationships was really central. And I think it's interesting for the U.S. left for the Iraq War, where there was massive resistance to the war starting, and then the movement has largely dissipated, versus the Vietnam War, where the resistance to the war really didn't start until many years into it and was a very protracted fight. And sort of, I think some of the really key groups in sort of resisting U.S. militarism are groups that work with veterans, work with soldiers, Iraq Veterans Against the War, really key organization. And that work, especially again as our responsibility as people in the United States, is really critical. Any other questions? Or thoughts,
Yeah.
resources? Yeah,
So,
Pam.
Hi. So I thank you for this very important background information that we need to have. Teaching it to the kids is another matter. Kids nowadays do not think about history of anything. You're the rare one. So about democracy, we don't have to listen to anybody else's attack on democracy. Democracy actually is falling apart. That's other countries' view of our democracy. It's falling apart within itself. It's imploding, actually. So I have been thinking about this, and actually I joined Fairville, Washington, and they have a very good push on improving our democracy. And also Fix Democracy First is another very good background information about fixing our democracy. And I'm so glad, that's one point. And the second point is, I'm so glad you mentioned that NGOs are actually, a lot of them are backed by big corporations. So they used to be very good, but then now I don't really think I can trust them anymore, just because they're supported by big corporations. So your push about making this international movement or international idea a concept about revolution, and that's pushing it a little bit too far. We have to do it here within the states, within even 350 to make any difference, to push it to the international arena. That's the third point. Fourth thing, actually, my question is, the history that you brought up was all about mostly about the civil rights movement and that time. Those are small businesses, so people can sit in, people can go into the front of the bus, they can boycott, they can use the dollar vote. But right now, our economy is run by big businesses. It was run by big corporations, and we're having so much difficulty fighting the fuel economy, the fossil fuel economy. My question is, how can we, instead of using the dollar vote just by us, just using the dollar vote, using small means of fighting against the big corporations, what else can we do besides what 350 we've been doing? Okay, question to you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's really a good and important question. I think it's a hard one. I'm sorry I don't come with all the answers to everything. It makes me think, though, I think, the example of the 30s, oh, you're on mute, Pam, if you're trying to add more. The example of the 30s is similar, of the monopoly power of capital, of the labor fights were very much against massive corporations. When you compare to some of the ruling elite, or sort of like the Southern business interests, being a much smaller sector of capital. I think it's a hard question. I think being able to unionize those companies and have worker democracy within them is really critical. I also don't think the question of the more mid-sized business is irrelevant. I think a lot of the local fights where big capital is not necessarily on board for mass policy change around climate, but in the case you look at like the coal fight in Washington, organizers were very successful at turning the fishing industry, the tourism industry, a lot of local sectors that had a vested interest in opposing these projects and bringing them to opposition for when it came to very much local infrastructure. I think that's a good example where that can still work for obviously more local level fights. And it'd be an interesting question too. They bring up in the book the civil rights movement's targeted not just the downtown retailers, but also banks and bank boycotts where they're a little more concentrated. And then I wanted to speak to, I think, from my point of the internationalism, I think some of what I want to say is maintaining solidarity with the movements around the world and being in communication and connection with them. Because I think that's always been, the context of the fight of the civil rights movement and Black Power era were completely shaped by global anti-colonial revolution, and the consciousness of people was so shaped by international events. I think in the 90s in the global justice movement, the Zapatistas played a central role in people's thinking, and really understanding that the fights they're fighting are not separate. They're connected to the same system, they're connected to the same enemies, and we should be in communication and solidarity. And it really inspires people. I think when people see the level of struggle that people in the rest of the world go to for dignity and for their basic rights, it really calls upon people to understand, to really join the struggle in really deep ways. And I think there's a unique sort of, since Occupy Wall Street and the Bernie Sanders campaign, a much more domestic focus of the U.S. left than previous generations. That I think we should really be trying to build those connections and relationships, not necessarily we're going to go. Obviously, we have to focus on the U.S. here and our government, but I think those connections are really important. And I think too, also to what Lisa said, I didn't realize I didn't address it. The question of socialism. It's an interesting question. I think it's interesting how our young generation that didn't live through the Cold War really just like, yeah, socialism's great, and didn't have this decades of anti-communism, anti-socialism. And I think talking about ideas, I think I've done a lot of this today of talking about ideas that would fall under that without necessarily saying the words of how do we address these problems, what are the actual power dynamics going on, getting into discussions and debates. And I think there's a real challenge too of there's ideological resistance. There are components to society that are going to be opposed, and real thinking about who isn't opposed, who has a vested interest in these changes. And a lot of times it's people that are much poorer, people of color, working in different industries that a lot of times the more sort of mainstream nonprofit left is really not reaching at all and not in relationship with. And understanding that as a largely middle class movement, as much of the sort of like climate nonprofit movement is, there's a lot of sort of more sort of like the middle class tends to go both ways of supporting small capital and supporting more sort of like small business interests versus these much more deeper systemic changes. And I think we have a responsibility to try to align our community with this more deeper changes and goals, but also understand that the real social force that's capable of really again, this idea of where are people strategically placed, people in work sites that can disrupt those work sites, have much more leverage, and we can support them, and really supporting the ongoing drives of union organizing of many different industries is really necessary, and understanding that we are not necessarily the principal actors, and our communities can really go both ways in go many political directions. And what they support, and we should try to bring people on side, but also understand we're not the only ones here. Yeah, Edward.
Yeah, I have a comment. In order to build fossil fuel projects, they need money. So, being middle class, I went to my financial advisor and said, "Hey, you've got money in ExxonMobil. I don't want that." And I told him, "I don't want that. I don't want you to invest in some of these banks. And I gave them a list. Well, a year later, I come back and I've got an investment in Conoco. And I'm like, what are you doing to me? I just can't have this. And he said, yeah, but you made some money. Well, I made the point that I can't have that, and I donated the money to 350. So that's what you can do.
Good, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think with that, it kind of falls with the sort of Stop the Money Pipeline campaign, is a good strategic intervention of how do you turn certain sectors, can you turn the financial industry against fossil fuels? And these divestment campaigns have been playing a role in building that pressure. And I think it's an important campaign, but I think it's a question of what sort of leverage do we have, and I think we need to move beyond divestment's important, but I don't think it's enough. It's not sufficient on its own. But is good and necessary. I'm glad you're doing it. I'm glad many others are doing it. Any other?
Yes, divestment is it's a very good strategy, I think. And actually, if I were you, Edward, I would pull all my money out of that and then actually try to research into companies, actually individual companies that are for green energy, renewable energy, and invest into those companies, companies. And for Conoco, for something like that, I would save one stock in there. So I would be able to go to their general meetings and then tell them what to do. Actually tell Conoco what to do, tell Exxon what to do, tell Bank of America what to do. I would keep one vote in there. My strategy.
Nice. Thank you, Pam. Any other closing? We're at 1:30. Any other questions or closing thoughts folks have? Cool.
Get out the vote. That's my closing thought. Get out the vote.
Yeah. I'm curious, what I want to see is there programs that are saying, in GeoTV, that are encouraging people to get out the vote and also be ready to be in the streets. I think doing that combination filmmaking would be good. And I think being ready we need to vote, and we need to do much, much more as well.
Really?
Oh, I see. Ed had time.
Vote early. They used to say vote early and vote often, but at least vote early.
Now just Trump says vote early and vote often.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would like to know where all you people are from. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin.
Wow. I'm from North Seattle.
I recently moved from New Jersey to San Diego.
Oh.
I'm in Seattle. I was going to say, I'm happy to send out some links. I would highly recommend the Levers of Power, and This Is an Uprising as books to read. I'm happy to send out further resources. I think given we're at 5 minutes past, I'll close it out for now, but if you have any questions, just feel free to email back to the Zoom link.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks so much,
Thank
everybody.
you, Scott.
Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye.
Feedback is great and helpful, so if you have any thoughts you want to share, feel free to send that along. I want to learn from and be better at doing this.